Hello, everybody. It's Kathleen Burns Kingsbury, and I am here to wish you a happy International Women's Day. I don't know about you, but if you've been on social, you have been bombarded by all the information out there about International Women's Day, which is basically a celebration of women, their accomplishments. And this year, the call to action is break the bias. So the hashtag is hashtag break the bias. So you want to check that out and you want to check out everything that's happening on social, as well as go to the um, internationalwomensday.com and check out all the information. They have reports, they have data, they have so much information that's really, really useful in helping you break the bias. Whether you are someone like myself, who's a woman in business, who is trying to make sure that she's getting an equitable wage and doing good work, or whether you're a male ally who is really interested in empowering the women around you, whether that's your wife, your daughter, your sister, your mother, your grandkid, doesn't matter. So let's celebrate International Women's Day today. And what I thought I would do with this LinkedIn Live is focus a little bit on the break the bias, because as you know, I have worked for a number of years in as an expert or specialist or trainer, whatever you want to call me, in the women and wealth space. And so basically what always throws me is when I look at the numbers about the amount of wealth that women control, not only globally, but let's just look in the United States, how much wealth we control, how influential we are in terms of the economy, yet we still struggle to make a fair wage, to not be victims of bias at work, to really look and say, hey, a lot needs to change, not only for women that look like me, but also women of color and diversity. So we really need to be looking at this, and the call to action needs to be to take action, not just to watch this video or read some things online, but to actually take action. But let's start with women's economic power. When we think about it, if you look at the statistics that are out there, what you find is that women currently control about 11.2 trillion in investable assets. So what does that mean if you're not in the wealth management space? What that means is that 11.2 trillion, that's right, trillion, in investable assets. Investable assets are any of your assets other than your primary residence. All it means is whatever you have available to be able to invest. And you can't invest with your primary home per se. So investable assets, but 11.2 trillion is the point. We also are inheriting 70% of the intergenerational wealth transfers. That means that as a parent dies or as a male spouse dies, and if that person is in a heterosexual relationship, that money is going to his wife. So women are double inheritors, meaning we are inheriting 70% of the intergenerational wealth transfer, which amounts to almost $22 trillion. So we control 11.2, we're inheriting 22. And right now in the United States, women are the majority owners of personal wealth. We are starting businesses at twice the national rate. We are more and more becoming breadwinners in our home. The last stat I saw was 51% of women were the breadwinners in their home. The tried and true stat that's out there is 44%. But what do all these numbers mean? All these numbers just mean is that we as a group collectively have a lot of economic power. So that's on one hand. And on the other hand, we go, well, wait a second, we're still facing the gender wage gap. We still need to break bias against women, especially women of color. And we need to be able to earn our worth. So why is it that there's this mix happening? Well, that is a complicated question I just asked for a LinkedIn Live, but we're going to look at one aspect of it in honor of International Women's Day, and that is conscious and unconscious bias. So many of you have heard of unconscious bias and conscious bias, but let me just define it in case you haven't. So, conscious bias is being aware that we're doing something that is stereotypical or that is discriminatory. And most often nowadays, if we know we're doing that, we do it privately. We certainly don't do it publicly. So I would say most of the bias that women are up against, especially in the business world, really is the unconscious type. It's no longer Mad Men time where it was like blatant. Now we're dealing with what's called unconscious bias. And that is the bias that many of us have, in fact, all of us have to some degree, that resides in our unconscious mind. So you might say, well, if it's in my unconscious mind, I can't help myself. Well, not true, because a lot of my work is helping people take what is unconscious, bring that information to the surface or their conscious mind, so then they can make some decisions as adults around what they want to do based on that automatic thought. Because automatic thoughts aren't necessarily true, they're just automatic thoughts. So they probably come from your history at some point in time, something you've observed, something that you've learned, something that you've picked up on. And unfortunately, in the business world and the world around us, there are a lot of things that show us or reinforce our unconscious thoughts about women of color, about men somehow being financially smarter than women. Not true. So, unconscious gender bias is really something that needs to be broken through in order for us to be able to achieve gender parity, gender equality. It's not the only thing. There is a whole system out there that is set up in a way that it discriminates against women and women of color. That I'm not going to address today, but it is something that's important to know about, to read about, and to learn. But I'm going to focus in on what you out there can actually control when it comes to your biases. So, let me give you an example of a couple of situations that have happened in my career where I have thought to myself, wait a second, this is definitely a bias, and chances are it's unconscious, right? So, one of the most extreme stories that I have, or one of the things that kind of blew me away, I think I was still pretty naive about how much bias there was in banking. I'm going to laugh because there's still a lot of bias in banking and advising. But I was giving a talk on women and wealth for a large financial institution. This was probably 2014, so a while ago. And I was doing what I always do. I was interviewing the key leaders as to what were their learning objectives, what did they want the audience to walk away with, and I was asking some other questions just to help me understand the audience. As a paid professional speaker, my job is to understand who's in the room, tailor my message so it resonates with those folks. So I asked a typical question. What's the percentage of people that identify as men versus the people who identify as women in the room? And the response was, well, there's definitely going to be less skirts than pants in the room. What? I was on the phone, thank goodness. And this was well before the pandemic. So not everybody was on video calls. And I just remember thinking, thank goodness this person is not sitting in front of me. Because here is a group of four men that are charged with bringing in an educator to talk to their advisors about women and wealth. I ask about the gender breakdown in the room, and I met with a very sexist comment. There are more pants than skirts in the room. Now, because I was on my best behavior and I couldn't think of a gentle, nice way to address this at the time, I didn't say what I wanted to say, which was, what? Women don't wear pants? Thought that was not best for my career at that point in time. I wish I had come up with a way just to notice it with that leadership team because it was part of the problem. But I didn't. And I can just remember that coloring my whole experience of being like, wow, they are just hiring me to check a box and they aren't really looking at doing the deeper work. So that's an example of something that I think is a little bit more blatant, but I am not sure that this gentleman really knew how biased it was. Give you another example. A podcast guest recently came on and told a story about how she was at this big gala and she was there and she was with her father and her brother and her mother and herself. And everybody was dressed to the nines. Everybody looked great. And this gentleman, who's a very well known, affluent person, came over to the father and the brother and started to engage them in conversation about business and about what was going on in the world, and a really kind of really lovely conversation. He then turned to my podcast guest and her mother and complimented them on their outfits. And so, without him knowing it, he was basically saying men are for business and really in depth conversation, and women just look pretty. Now, again, I don't think he sat around and thought about that, but he did ultimately have that impact. And so, what my podcast guest did was really, really kind of cool. Later that evening, he came back to the table where the family was, and he said to the father and the son, I just wanted to get a business card. I really enjoyed our conversation. And then he turned to the mother and my podcast guest and said, I really appreciate meeting you. You are lovely women. And my podcast guest turned and handed him a business card and said, oh, you might want to have my business card as well. And it was kind of a nice intervention. It wasn't hitting him over the head with, oh, you idiot, which is what my instinct would have been. It was really just saying, hey, by the way, I'm in business as well. And to his credit, he stayed and he chatted with that person for a while. And my guess is he didn't make that mistake again. But again, it's example of unconscious gender bias, of when we're operating, not realizing that we're doing these things. Now, the examples go on and on and on, but I think what's most important today is for you to think about, well, what action can I take? What are the things that I need to do, not only just today on International Women's Day, or during the month of March, which is Women's History Month, where we're really kind of focused on this. What can I do all year round? And so I have some thoughts for you. The first is I think it's important to notice those types of behaviors in yourself. Now, it's not always easy, but the more you tune into and learn about gender differences, different gender identities, different stereotypes that are out there, the more you can start to notice when you say something and you go, oh, that might have not been great. That might be an example of me being biased. I can think of one particular incident that happened with my husband where it was a couple years ago. He walked down the stairs. He was going out to work, and like a true engineer working in Vermont, he had his Carhartt pants on and his plaid shirt, and he was headed out to the office. And I looked at him, and he was wrinkled top to bottom. It looked like he took his clothes, balled them up, threw them in the corner, stomped on them, and then thought, oh, I'll put these on. It's not a good look. And so he looked so wrinkled, and I love him because he's very comfortable in his own skin, but it felt like a bit much for me, that I sat on the couch as he walked by, and I said, oh, Brian, my husband's name, are you going to actually go to work like that? What is your boss going to think of me? And he turned and he smiled at me and he goes, say that again. And I thought about what I said, and I said, oh my goodness, where did that come from? That somehow if my husband goes off to work wrinkled, it's somehow my responsibility as his wife to make sure that his clothes are pressed. I all of a sudden found that 1950s woman buried inside. So I smiled and I said, touche, and he went to work. And I have held firm because I am a feminist and I believe in breaking stereotypes. I also believe in accepting people where they're at. It's a work in progress. And so when he's wrinkled, I let him go out wrinkled because I am a feminist and I am not in charge of how well pressed my husband's outfit is. But it's a great example, that story, of how we can be in this field. We can be talking about women wealth. We can identify as a woman and still have that type of bias. So just notice it in yourself. And that example with my husband, Brian, is actually someone else calling me out on it, which is my second tip. Surround yourself with people who are going to compassionately call you out when you're biased. Now, we're talking about gender bias today, but I would say any type of bias, racial bias, any type of discriminatory comments that you make. Now, we are not perfect human beings. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to notice this in yourself. I'm asking you to surround yourself whenever possible with people who will call you out on it. I have a great group of girlfriends who are career professionals that all are empowered and have voices and have a great sense of humor. And we will call each other out on it. Not to be mean, not to be nasty, but to just notice and say, hey, that wasn't great. And then we have a conversation about it. I know my husband will do that for me, and I will do that for him. So you want to pick some safe people to surround yourself with and have people compassionately call you out. Let me give you an example of how this worked at work with another story that I heard interviewing a podcast guest. This woman actually was negotiating with a future employer, excuse me, a future employee. So she was the leader interviewing the other person. And what she noticed was this woman was making every single negotiating mistake there is to make. She wasn't sitting with silence. She was negotiating against herself. She went from asking for a decent, middle of the range fee or salary and kind of talked her way back out of it. And so this person just watched her as a female ally. She just watched her and she let her do her thing. But eventually she said, you know what? You just negotiated against yourself. And so I'm going to give you actually an offer that's higher than what you just negotiated. And when you come to work for me, we're going to talk about how you can improve your negotiation skills. So, isn't that a lovely way of calling somebody out and helping them break the bias, helping them be more powerful? I just love that story. There was another story I heard the other day when I was teaching at Champlain College, and a professor who had negotiated with another college and was soon leaving talked about being in that negotiation. Now, this is high level, this is like president level negotiation. And in the middle of the negotiation, she was negotiating for the job, and the other woman who was interviewing her and doing the negotiation on behalf of her new employer stopped and said, time out. She goes, I just have to say, you're doing a great job at this negotiation. Time in. So she was able to be an advocate, cheer her on, but still maintain her role as somebody else on the other side of the negotiation table. So these are the ways in which we can call people out, either when they're doing something wrong or when they're doing something right, and help break the bias. So notice it in yourself. You're going to want to surround yourself with people who will gently and compassionately, whenever possible, or for me, it would be with humor, call you out on things. And then the last thing you want to do is think about how you can pay it forward. Who can you mentor? Who can you support? If you are a male ally out there, and we're talking today about International Women's Day, think about somebody on your staff or somebody in your life where you could talk to them about negotiation. You could talk to them about what are the things that you notice in the world and how can they operate and be their authentic selves, but at the same time, work to break the bias. So we want to pay it forward. I know for myself, what I've decided to do this year is to give back some time to local colleges to be able to run negotiation classes for new graduates or people who are about to graduate, because I really believe that if we get them then, if we get them on their first job and help them see how to negotiate, these women will be more effective. The other thing that I've noticed about Gen Z, but also some millennials, is if you give them the skills, if you mentor them, if you sponsor them, if you encourage them, and you help them break the bias and you help them move forward, they then do it for somebody else. And there is nothing more satisfying to me than actually having an impact on one person and seeing it kind of trickle forward. It's almost like a drop, raindrop on a still pond, and you're that raindrop and it circles out. Oh, I just love that. That is kind of the essence of what I've tried to do with my speaking and my training and my coaching. And that's what I would love for you to think about in terms of breaking the bias. So today we celebrate women. We have come a long way. We have a long way to go, but I know we can break the bias. If you notice bias in yourself, if you compassionately notice in other people, and you work to sponsor, mentor, and educate the women behind us, pretty soon we won't need an International Women's Day. It'll just be another day. So this is Kathleen Burns Kingsbury. Thank you for joining my live or watching it later. If you are interested in knowing more about my work, you can go to my website, which is breakingmoneysilence.com. I have a free negotiation course that I encourage you to sign up for, and it is located in my Breaking Money Silence Learning Lab, and you can get there by going to courses.breakingmoneysilence.com. Thanks, and I'll see you next week.